Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the second of many videos on the glorious Our Mutual Friend as part of the read-along I am currently hosting. If you're not aware, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. So we're reading the book in the serialised parts that the Victorians would have read it in. So last month we read chapters 1 to 4, and I will link down below my video on that. This month, June, we read chapters 5, 6 and 7, so I'm going to be talking about them today. As usual, this video will contain spoilers for up to chapter 7, but it will not contain spoilers for anything later in the book. As I did last time, I will talk about each chapter in turn, reviewing what happened and then talking about some of the points of interest I think are worth looking at in those chapters. As usual, let me know what you thought down in the comments and on Twitter and Goodreads. I've been really enjoying reading what everyone has to say on the Goodreads group so far. However, before I get into talking about each chapter individually, I want to talk about respectability, because respectability is a very important theme in these few chapters, and in fact throughout the whole of Our Mutual Friend, throughout the whole of Dickens, and throughout the whole of most of Victorian literature and culture. At some point in my long, ongoing, forever, eternal, very delayed How to Speak Victorian series, I am going to make a video all about respectability and its role within Victorian society and literature, but for now I just wanted to quickly go over what it is. And at the beginning of the Victorian era, it's mostly a kind of middle class school of thought. The idea of respectability is that to be respectable, you are hardworking, you are honest, you have enough money to get by, you're never in debt, but you don't have too much money and you don't spend too much money. You are balanced, you're even, you are moral, you go to church on Sundays, you have worked for your own money, you work hard, you maybe have 1 or 2 servants, but you're not lavish with your expenditure. And in general, you are someone who everyone else could look up to in some way. The idea of respectability is that it is partly to do with being something, but it's also partly to do with appearing something. People who are advocates of middle class respectability really dislike people who are upper class. There is this idea that the gentry and the aristocracy are lazy and immoral, they don't work hard for their money, they have, you know, illicit affairs and that kind of thing, and they're not responsible, respectable people. Respectability is not to do with lavish parties, it's to do with domesticity and morality, and therefore the upper classes are considered not respectable by many people in the middle class. As we get later on into the Victorian period, there also develops a kind of counter school of thought, a working class respectability, which does set itself up in opposition to middle class respectability. Working class respectability, like middle class respectability, is about working hard, having enough money to make ends meet, and being moral, but it sets itself up in opposition to middle class respectability in a number of ways. Middle class respectability is, you know, drinking wine and tea. Working class respectability is very much not drinking wine. Working class respectability in the end of the 19th century gets very caught up in the temperance movement and people who do not drink. Working class respectability is often also less Anglican, and there is more room for non-conformist Christianity. Also, middle class respectability tends to be about being independent as a family unit, and working class respectability tends to be more about being independent as a class, so it's not so much that you refuse help from anyone, it's that you refuse help from people from the middle class. Working class respectability is often bound up with friendly societies and kind of helping other people within your class, but not taking help from anyone who is wealthier than you. What I'm trying to say in that long tangent is that respectability is very important to schools of thought and to culture in the Victorian period. So anyway, moving on from that tangent. So in the 3 chapters we read this month, we were introduced to many new characters, because Dickens likes to keep introducing new people throughout the whole of the book. So in chapter 5, Boffin's Bower, we are introduced to Mr. Wegg. Now, Mr. Wegg is very interesting in how he stands towards respectability. He holds a stall and he sells ballads, soggy gingerbread and various bits and bobs. That's what he does. But he likes to pretend that he's associated with the house that he puts his stall outside, that he actually works for them, because that would be more respectable than what he does. He pretends he knows the house really well and that he knows everyone that lives there, and he makes up this whole kind of fantasy in his mind about how important he is in relation to these people who actually have no idea who he is, which on the one hand is very funny and on the other hand is kind of sad. And in this chapter, Mr. Wegg meets Mr. Boffin. Mr. Boffin has recently come into some money, and the money that he has come into is the fortune which is at the heart of Our Mutual Friend, which is at the heart of the first 4 chapters as well. We know from the first 4 chapters that old Mr. Harmon, after his death, left his money to his son, who then was found drowned. Therefore, the money that was supposed to go to his son has instead gone elsewhere, and it's gone to one of his old employees, who turns out to be Mr. Boffin. Now, Mr. Boffin meets Mr. Wegg and engages Mr. Wegg to work for him, to read to him and his wife several evenings a week, because neither him or his wife can read. Later in the chapter, Mr. Wegg goes along to the house of Mr. Boffin and meets Mrs. Boffin as well and reads to them, and that is what happens in this chapter. So, interesting things in this chapter. As I already said, Wegg's idea of respectability and wanting to be more important than he is very significant here. Respectability for Wegg is definitely not about being moral, it's about having the appearance of being important. That's what he wants. He wants to be important, and it's interesting the way he views the world. Everything is about money and investment and how far he can get on. So he sees Mr. Boffin and he looks at him and he thinks, shall I invest a bow in him? And that word invest, he is trying to work out whether or not it is worth his while to bow at Mr. Boffin. And then when he does bow at Mr. Boffin says, morning sir, and Mr. Wegg is like, damn, I shouldn't have bowed at him. He called me sir, so obviously I'm above him. This kind of anxiety about class position and who is above who within society is very, very interesting in the whole of Our Mutual Friend, and especially in this chapter. Wegg can't work out what class Mr. Boffin is, and that is really important because Mr. Boffin at this stage does occupy a dubious class position. He's been a worker all his life, he can't read, he pronounces his V's as W's, which in Dickens and a lot of Victorian literature is a sign for being working class. However, he has just come into a lot of money and he has now been raised far above what he has been born to. Mr. Wegg is definitely beneath Mr. Boffin, but Mr. Wegg can read and Boffin really respects him for that, and there's a really interesting dynamic between them. Mr. Boffin is now wealthy, but he doesn't have the cultural signs of the class that he is now being forced into. And in their conversation about being able to read, we get this other really important theme in Our Mutual Friend, which is that of education. We saw it in the first chapter between Lizzie and Charlie Hexam and their father, and the fact that Gaffer Hexam is not very pleased about the fact that his son can read. This theme of being able to read or not is very important in Our Mutual Friend, and reading is in a way power. The fact that Mr. Wegg can read gives him power over Mr. Boffin, and the fact that Mr. Boffin cannot read is very important to his social position. And there's that beautiful moment where Mr. Boffin tells Mr. Wegg about the book he has bought and tells him what it looks like and expects Mr. Wegg to know what the book must be just by the fact that it's red and gold, has a purple ribbon in and is 8 volumes. And the fact that Mr. Boffin expects Mr. Wegg to know from that what the book would be does show his ignorance, and it is both quite amusing but it's also really sad. Later on in the chapter, Mr. Wegg goes to the house where Mr. and Mrs. Boffin live. I think Mr. and Mrs. Boffin are a very, very interesting couple and definitely worth looking out for throughout the whole of this book. Charles Dickens is one of those authors, very like Jane Austen in fact, where most of his novels end with several perfect idealised marriages. However, in Dickens's work, as in Jane Austen's work, the vast majority of couples who have been married more than sort of 2 or 3 years are really unhappy and seem to hate each other. There are very, very, very few happily married couples in Dickens. I remember trying to look for happily married couples to make a point in my dissertation, and I could think of like 2 in the whole of Dickens's 14 novels. That's not very many happily married couples. It's interesting actually, because Dickens has his reputation for being this grand advocate of domesticity and marriage and so on, but actually the vast majority of happy families within Dickens are not like a married couple and their children. They tend to be really odd sort of surrogate families of surrogate parents and sort of adopted siblings and adopted children and so on, in a way that is really, really interesting. There's a great work of literary criticism on Dickens called Queer Dickens by Holly Furneaux, in which she talks at great length about the kind of odd family setups within Dickens. And most of the long-term married couples in Dickens are quite unhappy, but Mr. and Mrs. Boffin are a very interesting couple to look at in terms of this and how their relationships develops, and certainly within chapter 5 we do see a very tight-knit, very happy couple, which is quite rare in Dickens. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin really are 2 of my favourite characters in this book, and they're one of my favourite couples in Dickens. I love that on Mr. Boffin's side of the room he has everything that he would like to have on his side of the room, and it's all very plain and down to earth and comfortable. And then on Mrs. Boffin's side of the room, because Mrs. Boffin is fashionable, and now that they've come into their money, she wants to kind of be of a higher class than she was born into, and so her side of the room is fashionable, and yet they sit both perfectly happy together, chatting away in their 2 very different halves of the room. It's such a beautiful metaphor really for compromise, and shows the way that they operate together and the way that neither of them want their own opinions and preferences to impinge upon the other's comforts. I just think it's really quite a nice, sweet moment. There's a really lovely line in the speech where Mr. Boffin is describing why the room looks as it does, in which he says, "I should go melancholy mad without Mrs. Boffin," and I think it's a really lovely, lovely line. I think they're a very interesting couple, and as I said, definitely one worth to look out for as the novel goes on. It's interesting as well to note that now that Mr. and Mrs. Boffin have come into this fortune, they both have very different ideas about how to better themselves and different ways in which they want to better themselves. Mrs. Boffin's idea of what to do with their fortune and how to better herself is to become fashionable, to get fine clothes, to make the house they live in finer and so on. But Mr. Boffin's idea of becoming better, what he wants to do with this money is to gain himself knowledge, to buy himself knowledge from someone who can read to them. Mrs. Boffin isn't especially interested in the reading and keeps nearly falling asleep until her feathers catch fire and remind her that she ought to be awake. But Mr. Boffin, what he really wants is to gain this kind of education that he never had the opportunity for when he was younger because he wasn't of the class and the income who could afford it. They're different reactions to the money they now have is very interesting and very indicative of different ideas of what it means to be a certain class within Victorian society. Moving on to chapter 6, Cut Adrift. Now chapter 6 begins in a bar called the Six Jolly Fellowship Porters. It begins with the landlady, Miss Abbey Potterson, speaking to Riderhood, who is the man who appeared in a boat in chapter 1 talking to Gaffer and Lizzie Hexam. Riderhood is speaking to Miss Potterson when she tells him that he isn't allowed in the bar anymore, and he takes this as an opportunity to throw criminal accusations at Gaffer Hexam, Lizzie Hexam's father. As the chapter moves on, Miss Potterson speaks to Lizzie about this and tries to persuade Lizzie to leave her father to get away from all the unrespectability and immorality that surrounds her father. Lizzie refuses this help, but when she gets home, she decides to try and get her brother out of the situation now that she knows what people are saying and thinking about her father. She gives him what money she has and persuades him to go away to school. When Gaffer Hexam comes back, Lizzie tells him that Charlie has left. Gaffer is very, very angry in a way that frightens Lizzie now that she has heard all these things about him. Even though she trusts him and cares about him, it's still a too horrid thing to imagine. So, let's talk about points of interest in this chapter. There are so many. Firstly, let's talk about Miss Abbey Potterson, because she is a wonderful character and a very interesting female character for Dickens, and especially for late Dickens in comparison to early Dickens. Let me read you a very glorious description of her. Miss Potterson, sole proprietor and manager of the Fellowship Porters, reigned supreme on her throne, the bar, and a man must have drunk himself mad drunk indeed if he thought he could contest a point with her. Being known on her own authority as Miss Abbey Potterson, some waterside heads which, like the water, were none of the clearest, harboured muddled notions that, because of her dignity and firmness, she was named after, or in some sort related to, the Abbey at Westminster. But Abbey was only short for Abigail, by which Miss Potterson had been christened at Limehouse Church some 60 and odd years before. Now, I really love Miss Abbey, and I think she has done very well. That interesting mix she has between being sort of tyrant master, being stern, but also being sort of motherly. You watch Miss Abbey exhibiting so much power over all of these men. She says to Riderhood, "I am the law here, my man," which is a line I just love. I think it's brilliant, especially the use of the "my man" at the end sounds really kind of patronising, and I am above all of you, and I love that about Miss Abbey. I think she's a wonderful character in that sense. So we have her exhibiting her power in that way, but then when the bar is closing, she exhibits power in a certain way in telling all the men to go home, but it's also kind of motherly in the way of her saying, "What are you doing out here? You've got to be responsible, go home to your wife." We have this mix of sternness and kindness within Abbey, and more importantly as well, Dickens talks about her dignity and firmness. And these are two very interesting words to go together to describe a female character within Dickens. In Dickens' earlier works, and when I say earlier works, I tend to mean anything before Dombey and Son, most of his female characters tend to be one of three main types. They're either the angelic, beautiful, moral heroines, or they're sort of older mother figures who are often a bit silly, or they tend to be sort of harsh, tyrannical, grotesque figures. In early Dickens, a character like Miss Abbey would not have been both dignified and firm. She would have been one or the other. Again, the reason why I'll Meet Your Friend is my favourite Dickens novel is because it, to me, has the most complex characters, both men and women. It's the book for me where, although Dickens' characters are very, very eccentric, they are not stereotypes at all. They are all fascinating and complex in their own ways, which is something I love. Anyway, moving on from that, I think Miss Abbey is a really interesting character in that way, and it's very important that Dickens describes her like that. Again, in this chapter, we have that important issue of respectability. Miss Abbey is saying to Lizzie, "Leave your father, come to me." She says, "I like you and I want to serve you. Lizzie, come under my direction. Don't fling yourself away, my girl, but be persuaded into being respectable and happy." And the fact that she says into being respectable and happy implies that these two things must come hand in hand. But Lizzie's reply is, "I can't, I won't." She refuses to leave her father. When Abbey begins to talk to her about suspicions against her father, Lizzie thinks that people may have worked out that Gaffer Hexam is robbing many of the bodies that he finds. But when it turns out that Abbey is implying that Gaffer may be killing many of the bodies he finds, Lizzie absolutely does not believe it, and she refuses to. Yet we have this moment where Dickens says, of her father's being groundlessly suspected, she felt sure. And the repetition sort of throws it slightly into doubt. Not completely, but slightly. And this is quite interesting because Lizzie's instinctive reaction is not to save herself, it is to save her brother. And in a way here, she acts quite like Miss Potterson, in that she acts both as a mother and schoolmistress in a way. Her instinct to save her brother is both motherly, but also very directed. She tells him to leave, she doesn't really give him a choice, and he immediately, his instinct is to obey. Even though he does argue with Lizzie about her reasons for sending him away, he never seems to doubt that he is going to go because Lizzie has said it. And the power she operates over her brother in that way is quite interesting. Lizzie Hexam is a very interesting character throughout the whole of the novel, in that mix she has between power and weakness. At the end of the chapter she faints out of sort of fear and distress because her father has stabbed the table with a knife and her brother has gone and everything is going slightly wrong, and that kind of shows that sort of physical weakness, but that is always combated with Lizzie's physical strength when she's rowing the boat in chapter 1, but also with her mental strength and her decision to get Charlie out of the house and away from the situation as soon as she possibly can. Accustomed from her very babyhood promptly to do the thing that could be done, whether to keep out weather, to ward off cold, to postpone hunger or whatnot, she started out of her meditation and ran home. And that kind of directness, the resourcefulness and the logic that Lizzie Hexam shows is really important to her character. She is rational and thinks fast. For all her lack of education, she is very intelligent and very resourceful in a way that is really interesting and makes her a really strong, complicated character. Again, in this chapter we have the very interesting theme of education. The fact that Charlie is going to go on and be respectable and be a schoolmaster, that is Lizzie's plan for him. It's not about being wealthy, it's about being respectable. Lizzie wants that for her brother, but not for herself. And then we have Gaffer Hexam's reaction. His reaction is to completely go against that. He does not want to be respectable, he does not want to be educated, and he has his own pride of his own position where he is so infuriated that Charlie is left because it is such an offence and an insult to him that he is not good enough for his own son. The scene between Lizzie and her father in this chapter is, I think, really sad and really touching in many ways, because he is obviously incredibly hurt by this, and he is a rough man and he is angry and almost violent about it. But then there is that moment where Lizzie is scared and he says, "What's come to you, Liz? Can you think I would strike at you with a knife?" And he is so astonished that she could even consider that he would hurt her because he loves her that much, and they are a really close pair, father and daughter. That is a really touching and sad moment, I think, and it really sums up the sort of misery and complications of their lives. So anyway, that brings us on to chapter 7, Mr. Wegg looks after himself. Now interestingly, I read in the notes in my copy something I had never noticed before, that apparently chapter 7, this chapter 7 that we're reading, apparently wasn't originally supposed to be chapter 7. Dickens wrote a different chapter 7, A Marriage Contract, which is now chapter 10 and we will read next month. But because this chapter ended up being so long, it wasn't allowed to be printed in that serialised edition, so he had to quickly come up with a new chapter. Apparently it was Dickens's illustrator on Our Mutual Friend, a man called Marcus Stone, who, knowing Dickens needed inspiration to fill this place in this chapter, he took Dickens along to a shop very like Mr. Venus's in London, and it was this that inspired Charles Dickens to write the character and the shop. And this is fascinating because Mr. Venus, I think, is one of the most interesting characters in Our Mutual Friend, and it's so odd that he is there in the book by an accident of Charles Dickens writing a too long chapter, and it really shows you, I think, the way that serialisation affected how a book was published, because if the book wasn't serialised it wouldn't have mattered how long that chapter was, and then he wouldn't have had Mr. Venus in the book at all, and the book would have changed. And the fact that he didn't plan to have Mr. Venus when he was first writing, because Mr. Venus is quite a significant character, he turns up throughout the book, that really shows you how little Dickens often planned the whole plot out, and just how much things could change as the book was going along. I think it's just a really fascinating look into serialisation. Anyway, moving on to the actual chapter. Now, Mr. Wegg lost his leg in a hospital amputation some years ago. I don't think we ever really find out what exactly happened, but his leg, his bones, were sold to a man named Mr. Venus. And in this chapter, Mr. Wegg goes along to Mr. Venus to see if he can buy the bone of his leg back. Now, Mr. Venus is a fascinating character and really fits into the whole themes of the novel very, very interestingly. We have in Our Mutual Friend this kind of trio of characters who make their money from waste. We have old Mr. Harmon, who has died, who made his money from dust and rubbish through finding what he could amongst the dust and making money from that. We have Gaffer Hexam, who makes his money by dragging dead bodies from the Thames, taking the money from their pockets and claiming any reward that there might be. And then we have Mr. Venus, who makes his money from bones and other such things. And that trio, this idea of money being made from waste, of people making their careers from the rubbish that nobody else wants, is really, really important throughout the whole of the book. And throughout the book, money is kind of sullied by its connection to waste and dust and rubbish. And that is a very, very, very important theme, and I love how Mr. Venus fits into this. And again, we have this issue of respectability on both sides of the table in this wonderful, wonderful chapter. We have Mr. Wegg, who feels that now he has the prospect of earning slightly more money and becoming more important within society, he would like to be respectable, and therefore he would like to own the bone of the leg that he is missing. It's so Dickensian and dark, but also kind of completely understandable, but quite odd. I love Dickens' oddness so much. I think it's such a wonderful thing in his books. I don't think there are many writers where you would read a book and you would get this kind of setup happening. So anyway, we have Mr. Wegg, who wants to purchase the bones of his leg back in order to be more respectable, and then we have Mr. Venus, who is at the top of his trade and is doing very, very well, earning significantly, but the woman he loves refuses to marry him because in her eyes his job is not respectable and she does not like what he does for a living. She does not want to be regarded in that bony light. I love Mr. Venus. I would like to read a paragraph to explain to you why I love him. Mr. Wegg, not to name myself as a workman without equal, I've gone on improving myself in my knowledge for anatomy, till both by sight and by name I'm perfect. Mr. Wegg, if you was brought here loose in a bag to be articulated, I'd name your smallest bones blindfolded equally with your largest, as fast as I could pick 'em out, and I'd sort 'em all and sort your vertebrae in a manner which would but equally surprise and charm you. Isn't he a wonderful, wonderful character? What a man. I also love in this chapter how it's so dark that Mr. Wegg can barely see the shop, and slowly as the chapter goes on, the shop becomes more and more visible, and Mr. Wegg starts to pick out various different things, and you as a reader become more and more aware of what it is exactly that Mr. Venus might do and what his shop is. I think it's such a wonderful, unusual setup, and Mr. Venus is such a fascinating character. Another point of interest, this chapter is told in the present tense, and I don't know why. I mentioned this last month in my other discussion video, but there are quite a few chapters in Our Mutual Friend that are told in the present tense, and most of the kind of society chapters are told in the present tense, which I completely understand. It seems to make sense to me that they're told in the present tense. You know, he's showing how shallow they are and how this isn't just a scene in a novel, this is how these people really behave. That's what he's trying to say. So I kind of understand the present tense, but I don't understand why some of Wegg and Venus's chapters are in the present tense. I've never understood the significance of it, and I don't know if it's just that Dickens really felt like writing in the present tense that day, which is fine, but I want to know why. If anyone reading Our Mutual Friend with me can tell me what they think the significance is of having this chapter in the present tense when the majority of the chapters in the book are in the past tense, please let me know, because it has been puzzling me since I first read Our Mutual Friend when I was 13 or 14. That's a long time. It's been puzzling me for like 10 years. Finally, to discuss how these three chapters work together as a trio, it's interesting that we meet very few characters who we were acquainted with in the first chapters. Although we do re-encounter Riderhood, Gaffer Hexam, and also Lizzie and Charlie Hexam, we do not meet the Wilfers, and we do not meet any of the society lot at all. I spoke last time about how the first 4 chapters, that opening serialised part, really covers a very broad cross-section of society, people from all different kind of classes, and I think that's really significant because so many of Dickens's novels tend to have a lot of characters, and those many characters tend to be split across a lot of different social classes. So it's very important, I think, for Dickens to set up that there are a lot of social classes in the first 4 chapters and to show all the different levels of society we're going to be looking at. But this second serialised part with these 3 chapters is in a way much further down the lower end of the social spectrum. We do have Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, who are of course rising in the world and have come into their fortune, but they are still of working class origins. And again, we have Venus, who is actually doing quite well at his trade. He is probably of a financial income to be in the middle class, but he is considered unrespectable because of the trade he has, and therefore that kind of pushes him down the social scale, especially in terms of respectability. It's interesting as well that chapter 7 was swapped in place of another chapter, because the chapter that was supposed to go there, which is going to be chapter 10, A Marriage Contract, in the next part, that chapter is in fact dealing with much higher class characters. So I do wonder how much Dickens tried to put into each serialised part a cross-section of society. I wonder if that was his aim. Regardless, the fact that we have these 3 chapters together and they're all dealing with characters who are slightly lower down in society, but many of whom in a way are on the way up or trying to rise in society. We have Mr. Wegg, who is looking at getting more money from Mr. Boffin and hoping to be respectable and get his leg back. We have Charlie Hexam, who Lizzie is making leave home so that he can become respectable. We have the Boffins, who are on their way up in society, and we have Mr. Venus, who is doing really well at his trade but just can't be respectable even though he really wants to be respectable so that he can get married. And so the way in which respectability as a theme is built into these 3 chapters and comes up in all 3 of them, I think is really, really interesting and makes them work together quite interestingly as a trio. And I think that has been everything I wanted to say about chapters 5, 6 and 7 of Our Mutual Friend. In the month of July we will be reading chapters 8, 9 and 10. That is chapter 8, Mr. Boffin in Consultation, chapter 9, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin in Consultation, and chapter 10, A Marriage Contract. I am very, very excited for these 3 chapters. I know these chapters well, and we shall meet some characters who we met in the first 4 chapters and some characters that we met in these last 3 chapters. We shall meet a lot of characters. It will be wonderful. Many glorious things that happen in the next few chapters. I'm very excited. Chapter 10, A Marriage Contract, is a work of literary genius in my opinion, but we shall see what you all think of it as the month of July goes on. As always, do let me know down below in the comments if you have any questions about these 3 chapters, and of course what you thought of them. Please do carry on discussing on Goodreads and Twitter how you are getting on with Our Mutual Friend, and as I said last time, it's not too late to join. This is a very slow read along that is going on over the course of 18 months, so you can join in at any point and you will probably manage to catch up. I hope you have all enjoyed reading the next 3 chapters of Our Mutual Friend, and I hope you will carry on enjoying the rest of the read along. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back soon with another video, hopefully a less long one.